Hello and welcome to ICMR NIE's online course on causal inference from observational studies, NISA 201. Welcome back to the topic logic and logistics of cohort studies. In this session, I will be talking about the strengths and limitations of cohort studies. Cohort studies provide a wider picture of the health hazards with a given exposure. We could investigate multiple outcomes that arise after a single exposure. For example, we can study the relationship between the exposure, cigarette smoking, and outcomes such as stroke, emphysema, oral cancer, and heart disease. So, the major advantage of doing a cohort study is investigating multiple outcomes. In a cohort study, individuals are identified as disease free at the start of the observation period. We have discussed this in our first session on the overview of study design. In a cohort study, individuals are identified as disease free at the start of the observation period. Hence, the clarity of temporal sequence indicating whether the exposure preceded the outcome can be established only in cohort studies. Cohort studies have the advantage of being used to study relatively rare exposures by carefully selecting groups of participants on the basis of their exposure. Over time, the exposure status of the study participants can change. Hence, it is possible to do serial exposure measurements during follow-up. Cohort studies allow us to calculate the incidence of disease. One of the main limitations of the cohort study is the need to follow large number of participants for long duration in case of prospective cohort studies. The main disadvantage of the prospective cohort study is that the time from the exposure to onset of disease, it's called the induction period, may be too long for diseases like cancer. If the disease is rare, we need a large sample size for a cohort study, and it may not be feasible to implement such a cohort study. We may need to consider other study designs such as a case control study for investigating rare diseases. Follow-up of participants in a prospective cohort study is very resource intensive, and the validity of the cohort study will be questioned if a substantial number of participants are lost to follow-up. Generally, studies that trace fewer than 60% of participants are often viewed with skepticism. However, even follow-up rates of 70% or 80% or even higher can be insufficient if the participants' last follow-up is associated with both the exposure and the disease. One of the main limitations of retrospective or historical cohort study is that the exposure data found in the past records tends to be less accurate and detailed compared to the information we collect from a prospective cohort study. To summarize, cohort studies are robust for establishing temporal relationship between exposure and outcomes as they follow participants over time. They are particularly valuable for investigating rare exposures and allow for calculating incidence rates. However, the high cost, the potential for loss to follow-up, and challenges in dealing with confounding variables can be the limitations in cohort studies. Thank you.